Hello, everybody, and welcome to the CITP lunch seminar. This is the last one of the semester, so thank you all so much for joining us today. Let's see, today I am really pleased to introduce a very esteemed colleague of mine. This is Dr. Amy Winecoff. And Dr. Winecoff is going to be giving us our seminar today. Again, the last one of the semester. Amy Winecoff is a data scientist at CITP. Her primary interests are in human algorithm interactions and fairness in machine learning systems. Dr. Winecoff received her PhD in psychology and neuroscience from Duke University. After graduate school, she was an assistant professor at Bard College, where she taught neuroscience, abnormal psychology, and research methods. After leaving academia, she conducted research and developed machine learning models for government agencies such as DARPA and the US Air Force to explain and predict human behavior. As a senior data scientist at TrueFit and Chewy, she develops product recommendation and search systems. She also conducted quantitative user research to assess how user psychology informs her evaluation of algorithmic predictions. Dr. Winecoff is passionate about diversity and inclusion in the technology industry. A couple of notes about today. The talk is co-sponsored by the Center for Statistics and Machine Learning. The talk is being recorded. So first we're going to have Amy give her talk, and then we're going to do a Q&A at the end. I'm going to ask that folks raise their hands if they have a question, as I'm sure they will. This talk's going to be awesome. And then I will call on folks to contribute to the discussion. So with that, I will hand it over to Amy for her talk today. Today's machine learning needs yesterday's social science.
Okay, can folks see my slides? Okay, great. Elizabeth, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm very excited to be here today to talk to you all about some of the work, especially some of the work that I have been doing here at the CITP. As Elizabeth already mentioned, my first foray into academia was not in the study of algorithmic systems or machine learning, but was in psychology. And that even today is the lens that I am bringing to a lot of the work that I do here. So, and this is not necessarily a unique lens. More and more what we see is social scientific approaches moving their way from the fringes of what would be the machine learning research community into the mainstream. And even though that's the case, what I'm going to argue today is that the social sciences still have more to offer the machine learning research community. And that includes empirical findings, it includes theoretical frameworks and methodologies that can really improve machine learning research that serves the needs of users. And I'll talk later on about how it can also serve the needs of society. So I'm primarily going to focus on some of the work that I have been doing here at the CITP. But before I get into that, I want to briefly touch on some of the work that I did in industry as a data scientist. In particular, I want to talk a little bit about how ideas from psychology and methodologies from psychology that were really pioneered many decades ago can still be useful for informing the design and evaluation of algorithmic systems, which was an approach that my team and I took on some product problems at a fashion tech startup that I used to work for in industry. So I'll quickly mention that this work was done with some fantastic collaborators, people who were also working at TrueFit at the time. And I'll be talking about that work that we did here together. So before I get into that, I want to talk about the product motivation that led to this particular research effort. So we were tasked by the product team with solving what is a fairly common problem for shoppers on fashion websites. And that is that a user can come to a website, they finally find an item that's perfect for them, they really like it, but then that item is not available in their size. So what can we do as a fashion software as a service to provide them with recommendations of other similar fashion items that are available in their size? Most often, the way we think about this in machine learning is in terms of distance. So the way that we would judge whether two items are similar, we think about that in terms of points in space. So you can imagine that we have two dresses, P and Q, and that we can characterize those two fashion items in terms of maybe the stretchiness of the garment, as well as maybe the level of the skirt and possibly some other features, and that we can draw a line between those two items, and that line is a measure of how far apart these two entities are. So when that line is longer, we would say that these entities are less similar, and when they're closer together in space, they're more similar. The issue with this approach is this is simply not how humans judge similarity. So a lot of the research that informed our approach here was drawn by a work that Amos Tversky did, which if you have heard of Amos Tversky before, you're probably familiar with his work as a behavioral economist. But in the 70s, he also did a considerable amount of work on how humans perceive and judge similarity. And in that research, one of the core facets of human similarity judgments that he was able to demonstrate is that human judgments of entity similarity, they're not symmetrical. So if you again look to this graph on the right, the distance between P and Q here, it's equivalent to the distance between Q and P. It is symmetrical, but this is, as I said, not what foundational research in psychology suggests how humans think about these things. So to illustrate this, Tversky and Gotti did an experiment in the late 70s where they asked people to judge the similarity or rate the similarity between two countries that they had set up that they thought there were two countries that differed in their psychological prominence. So they would ask people to rate the similarity of two different statements, the degree to which, for example, Mexico is similar to the USA and the degree to which the USA is similar to Mexico. So these were US-based participants. So their idea here was that the statement that would make the more intuitive sense to people is that Mexico is similar to the USA because the USA acts as a sort of referent entity. And this was something that they were able to show a finding that mirrored this pattern. So here on the right, we have what the researchers thought would be the less prominent countries. And these were generally gauged or judged as more similar to the countries on the right, which they thought would be more dominant versus the other way around. So again, pointing to how old this research is, you will also see in this list things like West Germany and the USSR. So these are not new insights. These are quite old insights about how humans judge similarity. So using this insight about the asymmetry between similarity judgments and also a couple of other core insights that Amos Tversky worked on human mechanisms of judging similarity, what my colleagues and I were able to do was to develop an item similarity metric that was informed by some of this research based on psychology. But another component of what we wanted to be able to do was to perform a psychologically informed assessment of how well this model was performing. So the most obvious way to do this, and as I've already mentioned, this is somewhat similar to the Tversky experiment, we might use what is sometimes talked about in other cases as like a Likert scale. So you have two different objects here and you ask people, how similar are these two dresses? You provide them with a scale that says very similar to very dissimilar, and you look at people's ratings and that can help you gauge similarity. This is one way to do that, but unlike in the Tversky experiment, we aren't trying to, in our case, get an estimate of people's perceived similarity, but rather to figure out for them, when they have a set of options, which of those options within that set is the most similar. So we let this guide how we actually designed our experiment, and we leveraged a research design that's fairly common in behavioral economic studies and neuroeconomic studies, which is the discipline in which I received my initial training. And this particular kind of design is called a forced choice test. So what we have up here is we presented our participants with the image on top and asked them to say, imagine that you wanted to purchase this address that was on top, but it's out of stock in your size. But there are these two available alternatives on the bottom. Which of these two alternatives would you consider to be a better substitute for the dress on top? So what we're able to do here is to systematically vary characteristics of the dress on top and characteristics of the dresses on the bottom. And by doing that, we're able to assess the extent to which these different features contribute to people's judgments. So using this paradigm, what we were able to do is both design a model that was based on psychology as opposed to our typical mathematical conception, and also to design an evaluation that allowed us to assess that. And so this is actually, we did publish a research paper on this, but also this design did inform what ultimately got put into production. So what we're able to do here is to take these types of insights, in many cases very old insights and old methods, as a way to inform the machine learning research that we do and development that we do today. So the study that I've mentioned so far focused in particular on individuals. So how do individual users interact with algorithms, and can we incorporate an understanding of psychology of individual users and also the psychological methods into how we design and think about algorithms. But of course, if we want to understand more about the social impact of these types of algorithms, we need to move beyond this individual approach to understanding that there are many users in an algorithmic system. And beyond that, another element that's particularly important to understand is that it's not the case that people interact a single time with an algorithmic system and we can understand the effects of an algorithm as measured at a single point in time. In most cases of algorithmic systems, users interact repeatedly with algorithmic systems, and many of the effects of interest that we want to be able to study in terms of social impact, they emerge as a function of these repeated interactions, this feedback loop between how the user interacts with the algorithm, how that changes their behavior, and so on and so forth. So in the social sciences, we would call this single static snapshot a cross-sectional approach, and we need to move into more of a longitudinal approach that allows us to assess over time how these relationships are changing. So one of the issues here is that longitudinal designs are notoriously difficult to implement in the social sciences, which leads us to think through what are some other possible ways that we can understand systems that change over time. So in this next section of the talk, what I'm going to talk about is how some foundational ideas in experimental research methods, in particular experimental research methods in the social sciences, can help us design and evaluate algorithmic systems through the use of simulation. So I'll note here as well that this is work that I've done in collaboration with Eli Lucerini, Matthew Sun, and Urban Narayanan. So when we think about studying algorithmic systems over time, we need to think through what are the various ways that we might be able to do this. One way would be to conduct some experiments in a real-world platform. So maybe you strike up a collaboration with Spotify or with Facebook, and you want to implement some change in a news feed or a recommendation playlist, and you work with them to measure that effect over time. There are a couple of issues with this approach. Number one, although perhaps this is a discussion for another day, sometimes there are access issues for researchers that want to do that to begin with. But also from the perspective of methodological considerations, Real world systems are messy. So at any given time, they might be conducting a lot of different A/B tests. There could be changes in the algorithms that they push into their production system. It could be that there's a major world historical event that just happens to line up exactly with when you've implemented a treatment. So in a lot of ways, these are very difficult systems to control. And as a result, they're difficult systems in which to assess cause and effect. An alternative to this would be to use experiments on a research platform. So there are some existing research platforms out there, but you can also imagine that maybe you would build a custom research platform for your own research question. So you could design a recommendation system. You could develop some user interfaces for that system, recruit some users to come partake in your system, create a backend for being able to measure what's going on in that, maintain this platform throughout the duration of your experiments, and so on. But as you can imagine, the more I talk about this, at this point, you've essentially built software, which is usually not the goal of a research project. Usually researchers don't quite have the bandwidth to build MVPs for software. So what are some other ways that we might be able to address some similar questions? One way we might be able to do this is through simulation. So in simulation, especially for the kinds of simulations we want to do to understand the long-term impact of algorithmic systems, usually we'll have a couple of different system elements. We might have some representation of users, we'll have some representation of items, we'll have some mechanism through which users can interact with items, and then we use that data on interactions to train a machine learning algorithm. And it's from that machine learning algorithm that we can then derive some recommendations that then feed back in to those user item interactions. The benefits of this approach are that the researcher has complete control over the system. So you're not going to be dealing with all these other sources of noise that could obscure or even confound what you're trying to study. And unlike research platforms that are really hard to build and get up to speed, you can quickly switch out elements of the simulation and design arbitrarily complex systems to study effects that are of interest. And I didn't mention this before, but another consideration, especially that we have for real world systems, is ethical concerns. So if you want to study a phenomenon of interest, something like political polarization, there are some serious ethical considerations for implementing those kinds of designs and algorithmic systems that are in the real world, but you don't have any of those same kinds of concerns with the simulated system. So what I'm going to argue is that simulated systems in this way, one of the challenges here is that simulation as a methodology is not quite clear. Does this count? Is this more analogous to empirical studies, or is this more analogous to theory, the kind of work that we might be doing in theoretical math that's relevant to algorithmic systems? Well, the issues here is this middle ground creates some problems. Because it's in this murky gray area, we don't necessarily have a coherent framework to understand the value of simulation and also to gauge what do we think are best practices from simulation. So what I'd argue is that, based on what I've already described here, is that simulated studies are analogous to experiments, experiments that are conducted in highly controlled settings. So in an experiment, what we want to be able to do is have a highly controlled environment that's simplified, and that this is useful for being able to establish a theoretical causal mechanism. Now, this idea of using a simplified model system, you might object and say, you know what, this simulated system as implemented in computer code is just too far divorced from the kinds of complex human scenarios that we want to be able to study, and therefore it's not particularly useful. As an argument against that position, I want you to consider this picture on the right. What I have here is a picture of a rodent who is inside what is known as a Skinner box, named after the famous psychologist B.F. Skinner. So in a Skinner box, you have a rodent, and the rodent has this little lever. And when he presses that lever, sometimes he gets a reward. So sometimes that's after a certain number of presses or after a particular interval, maybe over time elapses. But as that rat engages with the system or that rodent, he's able to learn from that mechanism of instrumentally performing an action and getting some sort of reward or outcome. Now, this general setup is characteristic of what was deemed the behaviorist movement in psychology that really came to particular prominence in the 1950s and the decades around that, although the seeds of it came before. And really the idea here was that folks in this movement wanted to move psychology away from approaches like Freud that were not empirically testable into a model that was testable. And their core proposition was that we're able to learn a lot about a system by simply using a very simplified system that we think is the proxy for more complex human behavior to gauge that relationship between stimulus and response. Whoops. And this is quite similar, though, what we're trying to do with simulation experiments. And we know from prior work that simulation can be simulation can act as very powerful experiments. So many of you in the audience today may be familiar with the Schelling simulation, but I'll explain at a high level what that simulation attempted to do. So this was a study, I said again, conducted by a mathematical sociologist in the 1970s to understand the patterns of segregation that emerge in real world neighborhoods. So the setup is kind of like the following. So if you look at this first figure on the left, we have two different kinds of agents, some that are red, some that are blue, and they're more or less interspersed throughout some two-dimensional grid at the start of the simulation. And these agents have a moderate preference to be surrounded by neighbors who are like them. So the red agents, they generally want to be surrounded by some minimum number of other red agents, and the blue agents likewise. They want to be surrounded by other blue agents. And this is the preference that gauges the behavior of these agents within the simulation. So at each time step in the simulation, if agents are surrounded by less than some threshold proportion of like neighbors, they will move. And this simulation is then conducted repeatedly over time. And what this simulation showed is that when you run the simulation out, what we end up with is the patterns of segregation amongst these agents that at least qualitatively mirror aspects of what we see about neighborhood segregation in the real world. Now, it's important to emphasize that this particular model doesn't incorporate any ideas about history or political movements, more sociological considerations, economic considerations, basically none of the real world messiness that also informs how segregation occurs in neighborhoods. Still, though, what it does is provide one simple causal mechanism for how these types of segregations, this type of pattern of segregation might occur. So again, even these very simplified simulation experiments can tell us a lot about potential causal mechanisms. Now, to move more into thinking about this as an empirical discipline, one of the things that we have to consider here is not just like what an individual study tells us, but what a body of study tells us. And in order for a body of scientific studies or a scientific field to be useful, studies need to be replicable. This is a core idea, foundational idea in empirical research, including in social science empirical methods. So replication is really the bedrock of scientific progress. And this is really one of the ideas that's governed a project that I've been working on with my collaborators at the CITP, which is to build a common open source framework for conducting these types of simulations. This tool, which we've called T-Rex, it has a number of common components which can be flexibly rearranged and adapted to build arbitrarily complex agent-based simulations of algorithmic systems. So again, I've mentioned this already, but what our system has is some base components for features of agent-based simulations of algorithmic systems. So items, users, we have different models for user-item interactions, different algorithms, different ways to provide recommendations. And so these different system elements can be used as kind of building blocks. So one of the things that we want to be able to show about these foundational building blocks is that with these foundational building blocks, we can build these types of replications. So one of the things we did as a part of this effort was to replicate a couple of already influential studies of algorithmic systems and the simulations of algorithmic systems that have already been published. So what I have here is a figure from a prior simulation study that was conducted by other researchers, also here at Princeton. And what they wanted to do was study to what extent do recommendation algorithms drive users towards similar consumption behaviors. So you can imagine, for example, that if I like Casey Musgraves, and you like Casey Musgraves, maybe we're both going to want to listen to Miranda Lambert. That's to be expected. That's kind of the goal of recommendation systems. But what we don't want to happen with recommendation algorithms is to drive people in the direction of consuming more and more similar content, especially when that doesn't serve their interests. So what they were able to show here, what we have on the y-axis is an index of the extent to which agents in the simulations or users are consuming similar content. And what they're able to show is that when you repeatedly retrain these algorithms in a simulation, this drives people's behavior towards homogeneity over and above what would be ideal given their interests. So as I said, this was an influential simulation field. So we wanted to be able to show that our system is flexible enough to accommodate these types of designs. So that's what we were eventually able to do. So you see, again, similar outcome here where the details are somewhat not exactly the same as the original study, but what we see is that across a range of recommendation algorithms over time, repeated retraining within a simulation, we also see this pattern of over-homogenization of user behavior. So what we've shown is that simulation can be replicable. Independent parties can replicate findings from simulation. But maybe you would think this is kind of trivial. Simulations in many ways are mathematical systems. So if you have a mathematical system and you know what the mathematical specifications are for that system, then maybe it should be a foregone conclusion and kind of trivial that someone else is able to replicate that system. But I will tell you, based on our insights from trying to do this, this is far from a foregone conclusion. So one of the issues here is that, in a social science experiment, we have a lot of sources of error that are outside the researcher's control. So there are going to be individual differences in participants and how a different experimenter might implement an experiment, and a variety of other factors that we know would contribute some error into an experiment. And even though those things aren't there, in many ways, the amount of researcher control that they have over these systems provides a lot of opportunity to fail to replicate a finding because every element of the system the researcher defines. So particularly in cases where there's not standardization, meaning that researchers all all build their own simulations from scratch, every tiny element of how that simulation is designed is an opportunity for a replication effort to fail, which we did many, many times throughout the course of our own work trying to replicate some of these works. So what I've got here is a picture on the right of eventually what we were able to land at to replicate this original paper. And on the left is one of our failures to replicate this paper before we were able to arrive at the right conclusion. And this results in a qualitatively different pattern of results and would result in different conclusions. And in this case, this is a minor misinterpretation of how we had interpreted how the original authors had paired users together to understand their overlap. So out of thousands of lines of code, this is a single line of code that was different, that produced a qualitatively different pattern of results. And I'll emphasize again that there are four researchers working on this project, I think, that would meet most people's definitions of competence, and spending a lot of time to do this. So again, and this is our main goal, was just to replicate this finding, not to do our own science, but to replicate the existing finding. And this is still very, very, very challenging to do within a simulation study. So replication is far from a foregone conclusion. And again, this is exactly what we hope to accomplish with our common framework, is we want to be able to provide some standardization there. So not only will the framework be useful for being able to share code and be transparent with other researchers, but it allows some standardization in definitions and design elements. That means that there aren't quite as many avenues for replication efforts to fail. And I would say in this case that work on simulation studies of algorithmic systems can learn from the failures of social science as much as they can learn from the successes. So what I have here on the left is a paper that came out a number of years back, and it was an attempt to replicate quite a few important social psychology findings that had been published in prominent journals in the field. And it was undertaken by a consortium of researchers that really did this with care to try to, as much as possible, replicate these original designs. And what they found was only about 30% of the results were able to replicate, and that the effect sizes that they observed were much smaller in general than the original studies. And of course, there were movements towards pushing social scientists towards better transparency in their research designs and other behaviors that could better support replication efforts. But this really was a call to action that magnified these efforts already to move social scientists, these psychologists in particular, to embrace these aspects of open science. So again, this is the kind of perspective we don't need to go through these failures as well with simulation studies. We can begin to embrace these kinds of ideals from the outset, and that'll lead to better insight into some of these theoretical causal mechanisms that might underlie effects of interest. So what I've argued in this section of the talk is that simulations can provide a kind of laboratory for conducting experiments on algorithmic systems. And like experiments, empirical experiments, the success or failure of the field will really depend on these results being replicable. When I was drawing the analogy between rodent and lab studies, I brought up the behaviorist movement in psychology. But it's not a coincidence that this is a movement that is like important historically in psychology. This tends not to be the approach, at least in a exclusive sense, that psychologists tend to embrace today. Because as the field progressed, there was more interest in modeling to a greater extent the intermental models of people and the cognitive processes that were going on. And as we learned more about the brain, we knew we could study the internal system in terms of how and why people were making these decisions, not just the stimulus input and output. So that was one reason why the psychology tradition moved away from this, but another more obvious issue that you may have thought of yourself at this point is that people aren't rats. So we can't understand everything that's important about people through studies of rats. In particular, that causal mechanisms demonstrated in controlled experiments, that's useful because it can develop, it can provide a clean environment, so to speak, of being able to assess these causal mechanisms, but it doesn't necessarily follow that these mechanisms then in the real world, where there are a lot more elements going on, that those are going to hold in the same way. So just as we can't use like these simplistic models of rats and Skinner boxes in learning in laboratory, we can't extrapolate that to understanding how third graders are going to learn math. There's a lot that sits at the arrow here that is important for translating findings that happen in controlled laboratory settings to real world environments. So that leads me into the last section of my talk. And in this section of the talk, I'm going to be addressing some of these types of translational gaps. And in particular, I'm going to be talking about some research that I conducted with my colleague, Elizabeth Watkins, that draws from older ideas in sociology to create a better understanding of these types of translational factors that are useful for understanding how we can take theoretical findings in AI ethics and move them into their real world application. So as I already mentioned, this is work that I did with Elizabeth Watkins. And in terms of the motivation for this research, we know that AI systems can be useful, but they can also be harmful. So they can perpetuate stereotypes, racial and gender stereotypes. They can worsen mental health outcomes, for example, through distressing ads for people that have eating disorders. And they can also magnify inequality in terms of concrete outcomes, things like jobs or criminal justice. So we know this is a serious issue to consider, and certainly the research community and also industry practitioners and advocacy groups have responded to that. So a recent study estimated that there were over 100 different frameworks that had been proposed for designing or evaluating ethical AI and for promoting more ethical AI development. The issue here is that much of this research has been done in the analog of a Skinner box. So we have a lot of theoretical knowledge or demonstrations that are largely academic demonstrations of the concerns that we might have about the ethical implications of technology or things that we need to look out for. And in a number of cases, people have built tools, but we don't yet know how much real world impact these efforts are going to have, in part because we don't yet have a great grasp of some of these sorts of translational factors that are going to be important for taking these theoretical AI ethical results and putting them into real world contexts. So today I've kind of touched on the interaction and the feedback loop between users and algorithms as exemplars of human AI interactions. But in actuality, there are a lot of different human actors that are involved in algorithmic systems. So one particular kind of human actor that has a lot of influence here are developers. So people that are working in industry contexts that build AI systems, they have a tremendous amount of sway over how good these algorithms are and any particular harms these systems might have. But even that understanding alone isn't quite enough to get a full picture of the complex stakeholder ecosystem in which algorithms are developed. So you can imagine as well that developers at technology companies, they're also needing to serve clients. In many cases, they need to meet the demands of investors. There are a lot of complicated interacting stakeholders in this system. So the work that I did with Elizabeth was drawing from some old ideas in sociology that took some of these findings about organizational ecosystems that involve complicated actors. So there are a couple different frameworks that we drew from. One is the idea that organizations act in some sense like rational actors. They want to be able to efficiently create output from input. In order to do that, and they need to be able to manage their dependencies dependencies on resources and to, if possible, try to reduce those. Another perspective that's also very influential in the 80s was a perspective that said, look, organizations, it's not just a matter of behaving in these economically rational ways. There are also a ton of social and cultural influences that matter. And in particular, for organizations to be able to survive, they need to be able to accrue legitimacy in the eyes of other people. So the focus really is on cultural norms here in this institutional perspective. But neither of these perspectives alone can quite provide a complete framework. So what Christine Oliver in the 1990s proposed is a framework where organizations attempt to deal with these types of conflicts between their economic incentives and also their legitimacy goals through a variety of different compliance and resistance tactics. So it was these insights that guided our particular study, where we aim to answer two core questions. First, what institutional pressures influenced AI startup entrepreneurs in terms of how they define, discuss, and build AI? And second, how do they comply, resist, or adapt to these types of pressures? To do this, we conducted semi-structured interviews with 23 AI entrepreneurs, where we addressed their backgrounds, the kinds of technical considerations that were informing their organization, financial considerations, in particular funding and financing of their businesses. We asked them some about regulatory considerations and also about their own normative values and what they thought were the social and ethical implications of their businesses. So for the purposes of today, time permitting, I'm going to discuss two of those types of findings. One about financial considerations, and the other, if we have time, I'll also touch on the regulatory considerations. But I'll say that across the different interviews that we conducted, one tension that frequently emerged was that there was a tension amongst these AI entrepreneurs between the sort of institutional ideas and ideals of the scientific process and the institutional ideals of technology entrepreneurship, whereas science tends to prioritize careful consideration and rigorous work. Technology entrepreneurship tends to prioritize moving fast and creating sweeping and transformative technologies. And these two different institutional ideals sometimes conflicted. In particular, where we saw this was with respect to external stakeholders. So what our AI entrepreneurs reported is that often their external stakeholders, these are things like potential clients or investors, they just didn't have the scientific background to understand the value of some of these technical nuances, or they were more focused on business objectives, and in some cases, both. So I'll walk through a couple of quotes to illustrate this. So this was a quote from one of our entrepreneurs. Investors were like, well, these are just science projects. But the reason that it rubbed me the wrong way was that the fundamental key to why we thought that our product will ultimately succeed in the market was because of the techniques and rigor that we used. It was almost like an anti-science trivialization of what we do. So we see in that quote really this tension between these two different institutional ideals. Another way that we saw this manifest, and in particular how entrepreneurs attempted to deal with this, was through something that many entrepreneurs raised and talked about as the AI hype cycle. And I want to emphasize, we heard this in maybe a majority of the people that we interviewed, and it was not an a priori question of interest. This is very much on their minds in terms of their businesses. And what these entrepreneurs had to say was that even though they themselves were prioritizing these careful specification in many cases, technical practices that were quite rigorous, externally, they needed to use the rhetoric, in particular the rhetoric of AI. So for them, AI in many cases was not a term that they were happy to employ because they really didn't think it meant anything. They just found AI to be a buzzword that was useful for marketing purposes. The issue here was that they felt pressured to use this language, both because the external stakeholders that would be the target of this language often didn't have sophisticated understanding to know a lot more about it, and also because everyone else was doing it. So we see this in this quote here. I think the biggest part of the biggest issue, and this may not be unspoken, is that everyone and their brother wants to have AI in their product, especially in healthcare right now, because it's the buzzword du jour. So we heard this a lot, this idea of AI being a buzzword. So here's another participant. That's what you see in industry, everyone doing this and getting results by saying, look, we use AI. And it's almost like, why wouldn't you? Especially for people in startups, it's a very competitive space. So you're trying to get every edge that you can. I'll talk about this here. So in terms of how they resisted these sort of pressures to engage in this expansive idea of AI, they often still use this language as a marketing language, but internally they have very different, very careful and specific processes around AI. So, and they wanted to emphasize that to me in particular during these interviews, that they had rigorous data selection. They often had scientific subject matter experts on their board or employing them directly. And even in one case, an entrepreneur described pairing up with an academic lab to do an independent validation of their algorithms. So this scientific element is really quite important. So we'll touch on funding and then I'll stop so we have a little bit of time for questions. One of the other patterns that emerged in this study that I found quite interesting was that startups had a variety of different strategies for seeking funding, and that often they chose these strategies based on both what their long-term goals for the businesses were, but also some of their own ideological values. So I came into the study believing this, and our entrepreneurs also expressed this, that venture capital could be thought of almost as the default path for technology startups. So as one of our entrepreneurs pointed out, we looked at the VC funding route in the beginning because that's what you're told to do, right? That's how you get funded. This is the path. You go pre-seed, it's angel investors. After that, it's VCs, and you go through the series process. So VC can be considered a kind of default financing strategy for a technology company. But that by no means meant that this was the path that all of our entrepreneurs pursued. In many cases, we found quite a lot of reticence for people to pursue VC financing, especially experienced entrepreneurs. First of all, because they felt like VC financing was in conflict for their long-term goals of the business. So this is a quote from one of our participants. That was my whole experience at a previous startup. The VCs wanted to hype things up, get a lot of press, make a splash, so they could raise their next round at a higher valuation and look good to their LPs. That's an investor in VC fund, which was actually contrary to what we needed to do for the slow growth of the business. So many entrepreneurs thought that pursuing this default VC path was not actually good for their businesses, and as a result, resisted this institutional pressure to follow this default. So what we found is that AI entrepreneurs often strategically partnered with financing vehicles that were value aligned in investment vehicles. So we've already talked about science. A lot of our entrepreneurs pursued angels strategically that had some scientific knowledge of their field or deep field knowledge. Another value that we heard from them was autonomy. So they wanted to pursue a lot of investment or pursue investment vehicles that allowed them to maintain control over the direction their companies took. Many of them also expressed ideals of democratization, so expanding access. And we saw that in particular with how many of our entrepreneurs talked about using crowdfunding. So if you've heard of Kickstarter or something like that, it's conceptually similar in equity crowdfunding. People that would not meet the financial accreditation standards for investing in a VC firm can invest via these public frameworks in crowdfunding for startups that in many ways is like, or at least the startup entrepreneurs thought is like a democratizing investment vehicle. So in many ways that was aligned with their own normative ideals. So I'm going to skip a regulation elements of this in the sake of time, but I want to emphasize some takeaways here from this study. in terms of how that can inform this translational gap. The first is that startup entrepreneurs are not rational automata. They're not just trying to maximize profits, and in many ways, what motivated them to start these companies to begin with was not necessarily or not exclusively financial goals, but because they wanted to build something useful. And so those same sorts of ideals that brought them into the company also create a little bit of room through which we might be able to import additional ideals that are more consistent with ethical practices. Because in many cases, what these entrepreneurs are already doing was based in part on their ideological values and institutional norms. And this, as I said, creates an ethical opportunity to improve the practices in AI startups through education, through interventions, and I didn't go through this, but some aspects of regulation, and also some risks. So as I noted already, startups are very dependent on their external stakeholders. So to some extent, even if entrepreneurs begin to really prioritize some of the goals of ethical AI, they're still going to be facing off with some conflicts between their external stakeholders if those are things that their external stakeholders don't also value. So we tend as a community often to focus on models and to a lesser extent developers, but we also need to be thinking about targeted interventions for their broader community, not just the people who are developing AI systems. So to circle back to where I started, I've talked about a couple different things. The idea that psychology and psychology research methods can inform the design of user-centric algorithms. Also, the experimental methods can provide an overarching framework for thinking about what the value of simulation is, and also for what the value of simulation is not, for understanding the social implications of algorithmic systems. And also that organizational sociology can guide inquiry into some of the translational considerations that we need to be able to understand to create applied AI ethical interventions, taking the great work of academics and figuring out how to make that work within a variety of different industry settings. So again, I want to thank my great collaborators here. I did not include a slide, but I wish I had. At any rate, am very grateful for their collaboration on many of these projects. And I'll stop now to answer questions.
Absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much, Amy, for this super thought-provoking and industry-leading work and bleeding edge work. This is super interesting.